I remember the exact moment I stopped believing in my own happiness. It was not a gradual unraveling, not a slow dimming of light, but a single instant of clarity so brutal it stole the breath from my lungs and left me standing in a crowd of hundreds, more alone than I had ever been in my life. The morning of the railway inauguration had begun with such promise. I stood before the mirror in our London townhouse, adjusting the collar of my traveling dress, a deep burgundy silk that Henry had commissioned from Paris for this very occasion. He had been so particular about the details, the cut of the bodice, the drape of the bustle, the delicate jet buttons that caught the light. I had thought it a gesture of love, his way of ensuring I would stand proudly beside him on his greatest day. Now I wonder if he simply wanted to ensure I looked the part of the devoted wife, a costume for the performance we had apparently been staging for 12 years. Henry entered the room behind me, and I watched his reflection approach in the glass. At 43, he remained a striking figure, his dark hair silvered at the temples in a way that lent him distinction rather than age, his shoulders broad beneath his impeccably tailored coat. When he placed his hands upon my shoulders and met my eyes in the mirror, I felt the familiar warmth spread through my chest, that quiet certainty that I had been blessed beyond measure. How foolish I was, how terribly, willfully blind. The carriage ride to the station took nearly an hour through the crowded streets of London. Henry spoke of the railway with the passion he reserved for his grandest ventures, explaining the engineering marvels, the tons of iron and steel, the thousands of men whose labor had carved this path through the English countryside. I listened as I always did, asking questions I knew would please him, watching the pride illuminate his features. Our children, Thomas at 11 and little Catherine at 8, had been left in the care of their governess, and I remember feeling a pang of guilt that they would miss this historic moment. Henry had insisted the crowds would be too much for them, the speeches too long, the day too demanding. I had not argued. I rarely argued with Henry about anything. The station itself had been transformed into a cathedral of progress. Bunting in red, white, and blue draped every surface, and enormous banners proclaimed the triumph of the Northern Continental Railway. A platform had been erected for the dignitaries, draped in velvet and crowned with an elaborate canopy. I recognized faces from the newspapers, industrialists and politicians, lords and ladies who had invested their fortunes and their reputations in this venture. And there, at the center of it all, would stand my husband, one of the principal financiers whose vision and capital had made this miracle of modern engineering possible. Henry guided me through the crowds with his hand at the small of my back, nodding to acquaintances, accepting congratulations with practiced humility. I played my part as I had learned to do over the years, smiling graciously, offering modest deflections of praise, pretending not to notice the way certain women looked at my husband with barely concealed admiration. I had grown accustomed to such looks. Henry was powerful and handsome and charming, and I had long ago made peace with the attention he attracted. I trusted him completely. I believed, with every fiber of my being, that the vows we had spoken in that small country church 12 years ago were sacred to him as they were to me. The ceremony began with speeches that seemed to stretch into eternity. I stood beside Henry on the platform, my gloved hands folded before me, my expression arranged into one of dignified attention. The mayor spoke of progress and prosperity. A member of Parliament extolled the virtues of British ingenuity. An engineer described the technical achievements in terms I only half understood. And then it was Henry's turn, and I watched him step forward to address the crowd with the confidence of a man who had never known doubt. He spoke beautifully, as he always did. He spoke of dreams and determination, of the sacrifices made by ordinary men to achieve extraordinary things. He spoke of the future, of the connections this railway would forge between cities and families and hearts. And when he gestured toward me, when he thanked his beloved wife for her unwavering support and devotion, I felt tears prick my eyes. I believed every word. I believed him entirely. It was during the reception that followed, a lavish affair held in a tent erected beside the station, that my world began its slow collapse. Henry had been pulled away by a group of investors, leaving me to navigate the social waters alone. I did not mind. I had learned to be comfortable in such situations, to make pleasant conversation with strangers, to represent my husband's interests with grace and discretion. I was speaking with the wife of a minor baronet, discussing the weather and the remarkable turnout, when I noticed her. She stood near the entrance of the tent, a woman perhaps 5 years my junior, dressed in mourning black that only emphasized the porcelain paleness of her skin. Her hair was dark, almost black, swept up beneath a modest bonnet, and she held herself with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural amid the bustle of the celebration. But it was not her appearance that caught my attention. It was the child in her arms, a boy of perhaps 2 years, with dark curls and eyes of such a distinctive shade of gray-green that my heart seemed to stutter in my chest. I knew those eyes. I saw them every morning in the mirror. I saw them in my son Thomas, in my daughter Catherine. They were the Ashford eyes, the legacy passed down through generations of Henry's family, as distinctive as a signature, as unmistakable as a brand. The woman must have felt my gaze upon her, for she turned, and our eyes met across the crowded tent. Something flickered in her expression, a recognition that made no sense, a fear that seemed entirely out of proportion to the moment. And then she turned away, disappearing into the crowd with a swiftness that spoke of flight rather than departure. I excused myself from my conversation with some murmured pleasantry I cannot now recall. My feet carried me forward without conscious direction, weaving between clusters of celebrating guests, searching for that figure in black. I told myself I was being foolish. I told myself there were surely many children with gray-green eyes, that the resemblance meant nothing, that my imagination was playing tricks upon me. But my heart knew something my mind refused to accept, and it pounded against my ribs with an urgency that bordered on panic. I found her near the edge of the tent, speaking with a servant, her back turned to me. The child had fallen asleep against her shoulder, one small hand curled into the fabric of her dress. I approached slowly, uncertain what I intended to say, uncertain what I even wanted to know. "Excuse me," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, too high, too thin. The woman turned, and up close I could see the traces of old grief in the lines around her mouth, the shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and secret sorrows. She was beautiful, in a fragile, wounded way that made something twist painfully in my chest. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, and the fact that she knew my name when I did not know hers sent ice through my veins. "I did not expect to see you here." "You have the advantage of me," I replied, struggling to maintain my composure. "I do not believe we have been introduced." She hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw everything I needed to know and nothing I wanted to understand. "My name is Margaret Sinclair," she said finally. "My late husband was William Sinclair. He was a business partner of Mr. Ashford's many years ago. The name meant nothing to me. Henry had many business partners over the years, and I had never made it my concern to know them all. But there was something in the way she spoke, something in the careful neutrality of her tone that told me this partnership had been different. This partnership had mattered. "I see," I said, though I saw nothing at all. "And the child." She pulled the sleeping boy closer, a protective gesture that was almost fierce in its intensity. "This is my son," she said, "William's son." But even as she spoke the words, her eyes betrayed her. They flickered, just for an instant, toward the platform where Henry stood surrounded by admirers, and in that brief glance I read a truth she had not meant to reveal. "He has lovely eyes," I heard myself say, and my voice seemed to come from very far away, as though someone else were speaking through my lips. "They remind me of someone." Margaret Sinclair's face went pale, so pale I thought she might faint. "Mrs. Ashford," she began, and her voice trembled with an emotion I could not name. "Please, you must understand. I never meant for any of this. William knew. He always knew. and he forgave us both before he died. I thought, when Henry married you, I thought it was over. I thought we could all simply move forward and forget. The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. The noise of the celebration faded to a distant roar, and all I could see was this woman's anguished face, this child's sleeping form, those eyes that were so terribly, unmistakably familiar. "How old is he?" I asked, and the question emerged as barely more than a whisper. The child. "How old is he?" 2 years and 3 months, she said, and something in her voice broke on the words. "He was born in February of last year." I did the calculations without meaning to, my mind working with cold precision, even as my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. 2 years and 3 months ago, Henry had been away for nearly 2 months, overseeing a business venture in Manchester. He had written me letters filled with longing, with protestations of how much he missed me, with promises that he would return as soon as his obligations allowed. I had kept those letters, tied with ribbon, treasured them as proof of his devotion. All lies, every word, every sentiment, every promise. All lies. I do not remember how I extricated myself from that conversation. I do not remember walking back through the tent, past the laughing guests and the flowing champagne and the elaborate displays of wealth and success. I remember only finding myself standing beside the railway tracks, staring at the massive locomotive that waited there like a sleeping beast, its iron flanks gleaming in the afternoon sun. The whistle sounded, sharp and mournful, and the great machine began to move. I watched it pull away from the station, carrying its cargo of optimistic passengers toward destinations unknown, and I thought of how I had believed this day would be a celebration. I had dressed in my finest gown and stood proudly beside my husband and believed, truly believed, that I was the luckiest woman in England. Now I stood alone, surrounded by strangers, and I understood that my entire marriage had been built upon a foundation of lies. The man I loved, the man I had trusted with my heart and my future and my children's lives, had betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible. He had fathered a child with another woman, a child he had hidden from me, a child whose very existence made a mockery of every tender word he had ever spoken. I did not cry. The tears would come later, in the privacy of my room, muffled by my pillow so that no one would hear. In that moment, standing beside the empty tracks, I felt only a vast and terrible numbness, as though some essential part of me had simply ceased to exist. "Eleanor." Henry's voice came from behind me, and I turned to see him approaching with a smile that now seemed grotesque in its falseness. "There you are, darling. I have been looking everywhere for you. The mayor wishes to make a toast, and I want you by my side." He extended his hand toward me, that hand I had held countless times, that hand I had trusted to guide me through the ballrooms of society and the challenges of marriage and the journey of our shared life. I looked at his face, at the handsome features I knew so well, and I searched for some sign of guilt, some shadow of remorse. I found nothing. His expression was as open and loving as it had always been, and in that moment I understood the true depth of his deception. He was not merely a man who had made a mistake. He was a man who had constructed an elaborate fiction and maintained it flawlessly for years, who had looked into my eyes and lied to me with perfect conviction, who had shared my bed and raised my children and never once betrayed a flicker of conscience. "Of course," I said, and I placed my hand in his. My voice did not tremble. My expression did not falter. I had learned from the master after all. I could play my part as well as he played his. But as he led me back toward the celebration, as I walked beside him with my head held high and my heart in ruins, I made myself a promise. I would discover the truth, all of it, every lie he had told, every secret he had kept. And then, when I understood the full measure of his betrayal, I would decide what to do with the ashes of the life I had thought was mine. The railway stretched out behind us, iron tracks cutting through the English countryside like a wound that would never heal. I had entered this day a trusting wife. I would leave it something else entirely, something harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous. I would leave it knowing that the only person I could ever truly rely upon was myself. The nights that followed the inauguration were the longest of my life. I lay beside Henry in the darkness of our bedchamber, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, and I wondered how I had ever believed I knew this man at all. He had noticed nothing amiss at the celebration. He had accepted my silence during the carriage ride home as exhaustion from the long day, had kissed my forehead with tender concern and suggested I rest. I had smiled and agreed and felt something inside me turn to stone. The Eleanor who had awakened that morning, trusting and content, was gone. In her place was a woman I barely recognized, a woman whose every word and gesture had become a carefully constructed performance. 3 days passed before I found the courage to search his study. Henry had left early for a meeting with his solicitors, and the servants were occupied with their duties in the lower floors of the house. I stood before the heavy oak door of his private sanctuary, my hand upon the brass handle, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and desperate determination. I had never entered this room without his invitation. It was his domain, filled with ledgers and correspondence and the mysterious workings of his business empire. I had respected his privacy as a good wife should, but I was no longer certain I wanted to be a good wife. I was no longer certain what those words even meant. The study smelled of leather and tobacco, and the particular pomade Henry used to tame his hair. Morning light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating motes of dust that floated in the air like tiny witnesses to my transgression. I moved to his desk, that massive mahogany monument to his success, and I began to open drawers with trembling fingers. The first contained nothing of interest, merely blank stationery and supplies for correspondence. The second held financial documents, columns of figures that meant nothing to me. But the third drawer, the one at the bottom that required a small brass key, I found hidden in a porcelain vase on the mantelpiece. That drawer contained secrets. Letters, dozens of them, bound in silk ribbon of deep blue. I recognized Henry's handwriting on some, the bold, slanting script I had seen on countless notes and documents over the years. But there were others in a different hand, a feminine hand, delicate and precise. I did not need to read the signature to know they were from Margaret Sinclair. I sat in Henry's leather chair, that throne from which he conducted his empire, and I began to read. The earliest letters dated back 15 years, to a time before I had ever met Henry Ashford. They spoke of passion and longing, of stolen moments and impossible dreams. Margaret had been young then, barely 18, the daughter of a minor gentleman whose fortunes had fallen on difficult times. Henry had met her at a country house party, and their connection had been immediate and overwhelming. He wrote of her beauty, her intelligence, her gentle spirit. He wrote of how she understood him as no one else ever had. He wrote of love so consuming it frightened him. But Margaret's father had other plans. William Sinclair was wealthy, ambitious, and eager to align himself with a respectable family. He had offered a substantial sum to secure Margaret's hand, a sum that her desperate father could not refuse. The engagement was announced before Henry could intervene, and Margaret was married within 3 months. "I should have fought harder," Henry had written in a letter dated just weeks after the wedding. "I should have damned the consequences and claimed you as my own. Instead, I was a coward. And now I must live with the knowledge that another man holds what should have been mine." The letters that followed chronicled an affair conducted in shadows and secrecy. William Sinclair, it seemed, was often away on business, and Margaret was often lonely, and Henry was always there waiting, wanting, willing to risk everything for stolen hours in her company. They met in hotels under false names. They exchanged letters through trusted servants. They built a private world that existed parallel to their public lives, invisible to everyone except themselves. And then, 12 years ago, everything changed. Margaret's letters became less frequent, more guarded. Henry's responses grew increasingly desperate. Something had happened. Some crisis I could not yet fully understand, and in its aftermath, Henry had married me. I found the letter that explained it all tucked into a separate envelope, as though Henry could not bear to have it mingled with the others. It was dated 3 months before our wedding, and it was written in Margaret's hand. "My dearest Henry," she had written, "I cannot continue this any longer. William has discovered everything. He found your letters, the ones I was foolish enough to keep, and he has confronted me with evidence of our betrayal. I expected rage, expected violence, expected to be cast out into the streets with nothing but my shame to sustain me. Instead, he wept. He wept and told me he had always known, had always suspected, and that he had loved me anyway. Loved me enough to pretend, loved me enough to give me the freedom I so clearly craved. He has forgiven me, Henry. He has forgiven us both. But he has asked something in return, something I cannot refuse. He has asked me to end this, truly end it, to never see you again, to give our marriage the honest chance it deserves. And I have agreed. I am sorry, my love. I am so terribly sorry. But this is goodbye." I sat in the silence of the study, holding that letter in my hands, and I understood at last why Henry had married me. It had not been love that drove him to court a merchant's daughter with no fortune and no connections, a woman so far beneath his station that society had whispered about the match for months. It had been grief. It had been desperation. It had been the need to fill the void that Margaret's departure had left in his heart. I had been a replacement, a consolation prize, a warm body to occupy the space that another woman had vacated. The tears came then, hot and bitter, streaking down my cheeks and falling onto the faded paper. I wept for the girl I had been, so young and hopeful, so certain that the handsome gentleman who sought her hand was offering something pure and true. I wept for the woman I had become, a wife and mother who had built her entire identity upon a foundation of sand. And I wept for the love I still felt, despite everything, for the man who had deceived me so completely. 12 years of tenderness, of shared joys and sorrows, of building a life together. Had none of it been real? Had every gentle word, every loving touch been nothing more than performance? I continued reading, searching for answers, searching for something that might redeem my husband in my eyes. Instead, I found documentation of his continued connection to Margaret, letters exchanged in secret even after his marriage to me, meetings arranged when business conveniently called him away. The affair had not ended with Margaret's letter. It had merely gone deeper underground. And then I found the letter that broke what remained of my heart. It was dated 2 years and 10 months ago, written in Margaret's careful hand, and it contained news that Margaret herself had clearly struggled to communicate. "I am with child," she had written. "William has been gone for nearly 4 months, overseeing investments in the Orient. There can be no question of the father. I am carrying your son, Henry. Our son. What are we to do?" Henry's response was not included in the collection, but the subsequent letters told the story clearly enough. William Sinclair had returned from his travels to find his wife heavy with a child that could not possibly be his. And yet, impossibly, he had accepted the situation. He had claimed the child as his own. He had given it his name and his protection. He had done this, Margaret explained in later letters, because he loved her still, loved her despite everything, loved her enough to raise another man's child as his own, rather than lose her entirely. William Sinclair had died 8 months ago, a sudden illness that had taken him within a fortnight of the first symptoms. Margaret was now a widow with a young son, a son whose true parentage was a secret known only to herself and the man who had fathered him, a son whose gray-green eyes proclaimed his heritage to anyone who cared to look closely enough. I replaced the letters carefully, returned the key to its hiding place, and left the study exactly as I had found it. I moved through the house like a ghost, unseen and unseeing, my mind churning with the weight of what I had discovered. Henry had not merely betrayed me with another woman. He had betrayed me systematically, deliberately, for the entire duration of our marriage. He had fathered a child with his former lover and concealed that child's existence from me. He had stood beside me at the railway inauguration, knowing that Margaret and the boy would be there, knowing that I might at any moment discover the truth, and he had smiled and given speeches about progress and connection, while his lies surrounded us both like smoke. That evening, I watched him across the dinner table and marveled at my own composure. He spoke of his day, of the promising developments with the railway, of a dinner invitation we had received from Lord and Lady Pemberton. I responded appropriately, asked the right questions, smiled at the right moments. The children were present, Thomas speaking excitedly about his lessons, and Catherine showing us a drawing she had made of a horse, and I looked at their dear faces and wondered what they would think if they knew the truth about their father. I wondered what the world would think. Henry Ashford, the respectable industrialist, the devoted family man, the pillar of society. If the truth of his double life became known, it would destroy him. It would destroy all of us. Scandal clung to families like a disease, infecting generations, closing doors that could never be reopened. My children would bear the stain of their father's sins. My daughter would find her marriage prospects diminished. My son would be whispered about in clubs and drawing rooms for the rest of his life. And Margaret. What of Margaret and her fatherless child? If the truth emerged, that boy would be branded a bastard, stripped of the name and protection that William Sinclair had so generously bestowed. He would be cast out of respectable society, his future destroyed before it had properly begun. Whatever my feelings toward his mother, I could not bring myself to wish such a fate upon an innocent child. Henry reached across the table and covered my hand with his. "You seem distant tonight, my dear," he said, and his eyes held what appeared to be genuine concern. "Is something troubling you?" I looked at his face, at the features I had loved for so long, and I smiled. It was the most difficult thing I had ever done, that smile, but I managed it. "Only a slight headache," I told him. "Nothing that a good night's rest will not cure." He squeezed my hand and returned to his meal, satisfied with my explanation, never suspecting for a moment that his devoted wife had spent the afternoon reading the evidence of his betrayal. His confidence was breathtaking. His ability to compartmentalize his deceptions was almost admirable in its thoroughness. I excused myself early that evening, pleading my headache, and I lay in the darkness of our bedroom waiting for sleep that would not come. My mind turned over the possibilities like cards in a deck. I could confront Henry, demand explanations, insist upon answers. But what would that achieve? He would lie, as he had been lying for years, or he would confess and beg forgiveness, and either way, I would be left with the same impossible choice. Stay and pretend nothing had changed, living forever in the shadow of his deceit, or leave and destroy everything, my reputation, my children's futures, the carefully constructed life I had built. There was, I realized, a third option. I could discover the full truth, every secret Henry had kept, every lie he had told, and I could use that knowledge to protect myself and my children. I could become the architect of my own fate rather than the victim of his deceptions. I could ensure that whatever happened, I would not be caught unprepared again. It would require patience. It would require cunning. It would require me to become someone I had never imagined being, a woman who watched and waited and kept her own counsel. But I had learned from Henry himself that appearances could be maintained indefinitely, that a devoted face could mask a treacherous heart. If he could deceive me for 12 years, then I could certainly deceive him for as long as necessary. I closed my eyes and felt something settle in my chest, something cold and hard and strangely peaceful. The grieving was not finished. There would be more tears, more sleepless nights, more moments when the pain threatened to overwhelm me. But I had made my decision. I would not confront. I would not confess my knowledge. I would not allow Henry to see how deeply he had wounded me. Instead, I would watch. I would wait. And when the time was right, I would ensure that the truth served my purposes rather than his. The Eleanor who had entered the railway inauguration was gone forever. In her place was someone stronger, someone harder, someone who understood at last that love without trust was merely a beautiful prison. And I was done being imprisoned by beautiful lies. I found Margaret Sinclair on a gray October afternoon, 3 weeks after the inauguration that had shattered my world. She lived in a modest townhouse in Kensington, a respectable address, but far removed from the grandeur she must have known during her marriage to William. I had obtained her direction through careful inquiry, presenting myself as a charitable lady seeking to assist young widows of good family. The deception came easily now. I was learning that lies were simply another language, one I had been forced to master in order to survive. The maid who answered the door was young and nervous, clearly unaccustomed to receiving visitors of quality. She showed me to a small parlor where faded wallpaper spoke of better days and well-worn furniture testified to reduced circumstances. I waited there among the ghosts of prosperity, rehearsing the words I intended to speak, steeling myself for a confrontation I both dreaded and craved. When Margaret entered, she was pale but composed. She had known I would come eventually. I could see it in the resignation that shadowed her delicate features, in the way she closed the door behind her with the deliberate care of someone preparing for battle. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, and her voice was steady despite the fear I glimpsed in her eyes. "I wondered when you would seek me out." I remained seated, forcing her to stand before me like a supplicant. It was a petty power, but I clung to it. "You knew who I was at the inauguration," I said. "You recognized me before I ever approached you." "Yes." She lowered herself into the chair across from mine, her movements graceful despite her obvious distress. "Henry showed me your photograph once, years ago. He kept it in his pocket next to his heart. I remember thinking how young you looked, how innocent. I envied you that innocence." The mention of the photograph, a miniature I had sat for during our engagement, sent a fresh wave of pain through my chest. I had believed that portrait was precious to him, a token of his love. Now I understood it had been evidence of his guilt, carried alongside the weight of his deception. "Tell me everything," I said. "I know about the letters. I know about the affair. I know about the child. But I suspect there is more, much more, that I have yet to discover." Margaret was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on her hands where they lay folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," I repeated. "From the beginning. I want to understand how I came to build my life upon a foundation of lies without ever suspecting the truth." She looked up then, and I saw tears gathering in her eyes. I also saw something else, something that looked almost like relief, as though she had been carrying this burden alone for so long that sharing it, even with the woman she had wronged, was a kind of liberation. "I met Henry when I was 17, she began. "My father had lost most of our fortune in a failed investment, and we were guests at a house party hosted by one of his remaining friends. Henry was there, so handsome and charming and full of life. He noticed me immediately. He told me later that he fell in love with me the moment he saw me descending the staircase in my mother's borrowed gown." She spoke of their courtship, of stolen conversations in moonlit gardens, of letters exchanged through sympathetic servants. "Henry had wanted to marry her," she said. "He had gone to her father and offered for her hand. But her father had already accepted William Sinclair's proposal, had already spent the money William had advanced against the marriage settlement. To break the engagement would have meant ruin. So I married William," Margaret continued. "He was kind to me, kinder than I deserved. He knew from the beginning that my heart belonged to another, but he believed he could win my affection through patience and devotion. And in time, I did come to care for him. Not as I cared for Henry, but genuinely, deeply. He was a good man." "But you continued to see Henry," I said, and I could not keep the bitterness from my voice. throughout your marriage, even after he married me." She flinched as though I had struck her. Yes. God forgive me, yes. I told myself I would end it. After William discovered us, after I wrote that letter, I truly believed I could let Henry go. But he would not release me. He wrote to me constantly, appeared wherever I went, begged me to reconsider. And I was weak. I had always been weak where he was concerned. The portrait she painted was not of a predatory seductress, but of a woman trapped by circumstances and her own heart. I wanted to hate her, and part of me did. But another part recognized something familiar in her story, the same helpless devotion I had felt toward Henry, the same inability to imagine a life without him. "Tell me about the child," I said. "Tell me about your son." Margaret's face softened at the mention of the boy. "His name is Edward," she said. "He is the joy of my life, the one pure thing to come from all this sorrow." William accepted him as his own. He signed the birth certificate, gave him the Sinclair name, loved him as truly as any father could. When William died, he left provisions for Edward's education and future. He ensured that no one would ever have cause to question the boy's legitimacy. But Henry knows the truth. Yes, Henry knows. He has always known. He sends money, though I have tried to refuse it. He says it is his duty, his responsibility. But he has never acknowledged Edward publicly. He has never held him, never spoken to him, never looked upon his own son except from a distance. There was bitterness in her voice now, and I understood that whatever love she still bore for Henry was complicated by resentment. He had given her a child, but refused to claim him. He had maintained their connection, but kept her always in the shadows. She was not his wife, not his mistress, not anything that society had a name for. She was simply his secret, kept hidden like the letters in his locked drawer. "There is more," I said, because I sensed that she had not yet reached the heart of the matter. "Something else. Something about Henry that you have not yet told me." Margaret rose and walked to the window, her back to me as she stared out at the grey London street. "What I am about to tell you," she said quietly, "I have never spoken aloud to anyone. William suspected, but I never confirmed his suspicions. If you use this knowledge against Henry, it will destroy him utterly, and it may well destroy you and your children as well." I felt a chill pass through me despite the fire burning in the grate. "Tell me," I said. "Whatever it is, I must know." She turned to face me, and in her eyes I saw a grief so profound it stole my breath. "The railway," she said. "The Northern Continental Railway, the triumph that was celebrated at the Inauguration. Do you know how Henry acquired the capital to become one of its principal financiers?" I shook my head. He had always been vague about the specifics of his business dealings, and I had never pressed him for details. "William Sinclair was Henry's original partner," Margaret continued. "They went into business together 15 years ago, shortly before my marriage. William had inherited a substantial fortune from an uncle in India, and Henry had the connections and ambition to put that money to work. They invested in factories, in shipping, in the early railways that were just beginning to transform England. For a time, they prospered equally. And then? And then William discovered our affair. He confronted Henry, not with anger, but with a proposition. He would keep silent about the betrayal. He would even allow the affair to continue so long as we were discreet. In exchange, he wanted Henry to sign over his share of their joint ventures, all of them. He wanted to be free of Henry entirely, wanted to sever the business connection even as he accepted the personal one. I struggled to comprehend what she was telling me. Henry agreed to this? He had no choice. William had evidence of the affair, letters and witnesses who could testify to our meetings. If he had made the matter public, Henry would have been ruined. His reputation, his position in society, his prospects for future business, all of it would have been destroyed. So he signed the papers and walked away with nothing. But Henry is wealthy, I protested. He has been wealthy for as long as I have known him. He financed the railway with his own capital. He could not have done so if he had lost everything. Margaret's laugh was bitter, hollow. He rebuilt his fortune, she said, but not through honest means. In the years after he lost his partnership with William, Henry became desperate. He had debts, obligations, a lifestyle he could not maintain without significant income. So he found other ways to acquire money. What ways? She hesitated, and I could see the conflict playing out across her features. She had carried this secret for years, had protected Henry even as he failed to protect her. But something had changed. Perhaps it was William's death, or the arrival of my questions, or simply the weight of silence that had finally become too heavy to bear. There was a man, she said finally, a merchant named James Thornton. He had invested heavily in one of Henry's schemes, a mining venture in Wales that promised extraordinary returns. The mine failed. Thornton lost everything, his fortune, his business, his home. He came to Henry demanding restitution, threatening to expose the fraudulent projections Henry had used to secure his investment. I felt the blood drain from my face. What happened to him? He disappeared, Margaret said simply. One night he was seen arguing with Henry outside a gentleman's club in London. The next morning he was gone. His body was found 3 days later in the Thames. The authorities ruled it a suicide, said he had thrown himself into the river in despair over his financial losses. But William always believed, and I came to believe as well, that Henry had arranged for his silence permanently. The room seemed to spin around me. I gripped the arms of my chair, struggling to comprehend the enormity of what she was suggesting. My husband, the father of my children, the man who had held me in his arms and whispered words of love, might be responsible for another man's death. I have no proof, Margaret continued. Neither did William. But after Thornton's death, Henry suddenly had money again. He paid off his debts, resumed his place in society, began courting you. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Why did William never go to the authorities? Because he was complicit. Not in Thornton's death, but in the earlier frauds. He had looked the other way when Henry's business practices crossed ethical lines. He had accepted profits he knew were tainted. If Henry fell, William would fall with him. So he kept silent, and he used what he knew to ensure that Henry could never threaten him again. I sat in that faded parlor, surrounded by the remnants of another woman's ruined life, and I tried to reconcile the man I had married with the monster Margaret had described. Was it possible? Could Henry, with his gentle hands and tender smile, be capable of such darkness? I thought of the locked drawer, the careful lies, the systematic deception that had defined our marriage. I thought of how easily he had maintained his facade, how convincingly he had played the role of devoted husband while pursuing another woman, fathering another child, building our prosperity upon foundations of fraud and perhaps even blood. And yet, I could not quite believe it. Some part of me clung to the hope that Margaret was wrong, that her accusations were the product of grief and bitterness rather than truth. I needed evidence. I needed to know for certain before I could decide what to do with this terrible knowledge. Is there proof? I asked. Documents. Witnesses? Anything that might confirm or deny what you have told me? Margaret nodded slowly. William kept records, she said. He was meticulous about such things, perhaps because he always knew that one day he might need protection against Henry. When he died, I inherited his papers along with everything else. I have not looked at them since the funeral. I could not bear to. But they are here, in this house, locked in his study. I want to see them, I said, all of them, everything that relates to Henry and his business dealings. She studied me for a long moment, weighing my request against her own fears and loyalties. Finally, she rose. Come with me, she said. It is time these secrets saw the light of day. I followed her through the modest house, up a narrow staircase to a room that still bore the unmistakable stamp of masculine occupation. William Sinclair's study was small but orderly, lined with books and furnished with a simple desk. Margaret retrieved a key from a hiding place I did not see and unlocked a cabinet in the corner. Inside were stacks of papers, ledgers, and correspondence that represented years of careful documentation. I spent the remainder of that afternoon reading through them, piecing together a portrait of my husband that grew darker with every page. The mining fraud, the manipulated investments, the ruined families whose money had built Henry's fortune. And at the center of it all, repeated references to the Thornton affair, oblique but damning, suggesting that William had known far more than he had ever been willing to say aloud. When I finally emerged from that study, the sun had set and the lamplighters were making their rounds in the street below. Margaret waited for me in the parlor, her son Edward sleeping in her arms. Looking at them together, at the woman my husband had loved and the child he had abandoned, I felt something shift inside me. My anger remained, but it was tempered now by something more complex. We were all of us victims of Henry's deceptions. We were all of us trapped in the web he had woven. "What will you do?" Margaret asked. I looked at her, at this woman I had every reason to hate, and I saw instead a kindred spirit. She had loved unwisely and paid dearly for that love. She had sacrificed her reputation, her security, her peace of mind on the altar of a passion that had brought her nothing but sorrow. And now she was alone with a fatherless child, dependent on the charity of the man who had ruined her. "I do not yet know," I admitted, "but whatever I decide, I will not act in haste. Too many lives hang in the balance, yours and your son's among them." Her eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. "You would consider us in your calculations? After everything I have done?" I rose and gathered my things, preparing to return to the life that now felt like nothing more than an elaborate stage set. "You were not the architect of this disaster," I told her. "You were merely another victim caught in its design. Henry is the one who built this house of lies, and Henry is the one who must ultimately answer for it." I left her there in that faded parlor, holding her sleeping son, and I walked out into the London night with a heart full of conflicting emotions: anger and sorrow, determination and fear. And somewhere beneath it all, a strange and unexpected compassion for the woman who had stolen my husband's heart long before I ever knew him. The secrets I had uncovered were worse than anything I had imagined. But knowledge was power, and power was the only currency that mattered in the game I was now being forced to play. I would return to my husband's house and resume my role as his devoted wife. I would smile and nod and maintain the illusion that nothing had changed, and I would wait, watching for the moment when I could use what I had learned to secure my children's future and my own freedom. The railway that Henry had celebrated was built on blood and betrayal, but so, it seemed, was everything he had ever touched, including me. The confrontation came on a night of violent storms, as though the heavens themselves had grown weary of secrets and demanded their exposure. I had waited nearly 2 months, gathering evidence, making careful preparations, ensuring that when the moment arrived, I would not be vulnerable to Henry's manipulations. I had consulted quietly with a solicitor recommended by Margaret, a man of discretion who specialized in protecting women whose husbands had failed them. I had secured copies of the most damaging documents and placed them in safekeeping with people Henry could not reach. I had become, in those weeks of watchful waiting, someone I barely recognized, a strategist, a planner, a woman who thought 3 moves ahead and trusted no one completely. Henry had noticed nothing. His confidence in my devotion remained absolute, a testament to either his arrogance or his genuine inability to imagine that I might see through his carefully constructed facade. He continued to come and go as he pleased, to attend to his business and his pleasures, to kiss my cheek each morning and retire to his study each evening without a flicker of concern that his devoted Eleanor might be anything other than the trusting wife he had married. That night, he returned home late from a meeting with his investors, his mood buoyant with the success of the railway venture. The line was exceeding all projections, he told me over a late supper. The profits would be extraordinary. We would be able to expand our London house, perhaps purchase a country estate, give our children every advantage that wealth could provide. I listened and nodded and smiled, and I waited until the servants had cleared the table and withdrawn for the evening. Then, in the quiet intimacy of the drawing room, with rain lashing against the windows and thunder rolling in the distance, I spoke the words that would change everything. "I know about Margaret Sinclair," I said. "I know about the child. I know about James Thornton and the mining fraud and everything else you have spent years trying to hide." The color drained from Henry's face so quickly I thought he might faint. He sat frozen in his chair, a glass of brandy suspended halfway to his lips, staring at me as though I had suddenly transformed into a stranger before his eyes. "Eleanor," he began, and his voice emerged as a croak. "I do not know what you think you have discovered, but I assure you, there has been some terrible misunderstanding. There is no misunderstanding." I rose from my seat and crossed to the window, putting distance between us, needing the space to maintain my composure. "I have read your letters, Henry. All of them. The ones you kept locked in your desk, the record of your affair with Margaret spanning 15 years. I have spoken with Margaret herself, heard her account of your relationship, and I have seen William Sinclair's documents, the evidence he gathered to protect himself against you." The brandy glass slipped from Henry's fingers and shattered on the floor. Neither of us moved to address the spreading stain on the carpet. The destruction seemed fitting somehow, a physical manifestation of what was happening to our marriage. "How long have you known?" he asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. "Since the railway inauguration. I saw her there with the child. Your child, Henry. A boy with the Ashford eyes, unmistakable to anyone who cared to look. Did you think I would not notice? Did you think I was so blind, so foolish, that I would not recognize the evidence of your betrayal standing before me?" He rose from his chair and moved toward me, his hands extended in supplication. "Eleanor, please, you must let me explain. It is not what you think. Margaret and I, what we shared, it was over long before I married you. The child was an accident, a mistake. I have provided for him, ensured his future, but I have never acknowledged him as mine. I have never betrayed our family." "Never betrayed our family?" The words emerged as something between a laugh and a sob. "You have done nothing but betray our family from the moment you spoke your vows. You married me to forget another woman. You continued your affair throughout our marriage. You fathered a child with your mistress while I was raising your legitimate children under the same roof. And now you stand before me and claim you have never betrayed us." Lightning illuminated the room, casting Henry's features into stark relief. In that flash of brilliance, I saw him clearly for the first time, not the charming gentleman I had married, not the devoted husband he had pretended to be, but a man consumed by his own desires, willing to sacrifice anyone and anything to satisfy them. "And what of James Thornton?" I continued, pressing my advantage while he remained off balance. "What of the man who trusted you with his fortune and ended up dead in the Thames? Was that also not a betrayal?" Henry's expression shifted, the pleading softening into something harder, more dangerous. I saw for a moment the man who had built his empire on fraud and deception, the man capable of eliminating those who threatened to expose him. "Be very careful, Eleanor," he said, and his voice had lost all warmth. "You are treading on ground you do not understand. Thornton's death was ruled a suicide. There is no evidence to suggest otherwise. William Sinclair believed differently, and he documented his beliefs quite thoroughly. William Sinclair is dead. His beliefs died with him, but his documents survive." I turned to face my husband fully, drawing on every reserve of courage I possessed. "And they are no longer in Margaret's possession. I have secured them in a place you will never find, with instructions that they should be delivered to the appropriate authorities if anything should happen to me or to anyone I care about. The threat hung between us like smoke. I watched Henry calculate, watched him weigh his options, and realized that for the first time in our marriage, he was not in control. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want a separation," I said. "A legal arrangement that will allow me to live independently with our children while maintaining the appearance of respectability. I want a settlement sufficient to ensure our comfort without relying on your continued goodwill. And I want your promise that you will never again attempt to interfere with my life or the lives of Thomas and Catherine." "You would destroy yourself," he said, and there was genuine confusion in his voice. "A separation will bring scandal. Society will shun you. Our children will suffer the consequences of your pride. They will suffer far worse if they grow to adulthood in a household built on lies." I moved toward the door, pausing with my hand on the frame. "I have seen your true nature, Henry. I know what you are capable of, and I will not allow my children to be shaped by your influence any longer." I left him standing in the drawing room, surrounded by the wreckage of his deceptions, and I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, with my heart pounding and my legs trembling beneath my skirts. I had done it. I had confronted him. I had set in motion the events that would either free me or destroy me. The days that followed were a strange kind of purgatory. Henry and I moved through the house like ghosts, speaking only when necessary, maintaining the facade of normalcy before the servants and children while privately waging a war of wills. He tried alternately to charm and to threaten, to promise reformation and to hint at consequences. I remained unmoved by both approaches. I had seen behind the mask. I could not unsee it. It was during this period of stalemate that I received an unexpected ally. A letter arrived one morning, addressed in a hand I did not recognize, bearing no return direction. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a calling card. The letter read simply, "I knew James Thornton. I know what your husband did. If you wish to learn more, send word to the address below. A friend." The calling card bore the name Edmund Gray and an address in Chelsea. I turned it over in my hands, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. This could be a trap laid by Henry to discover the extent of my knowledge. Or it could be genuine, a survivor of Henry's machinations reaching out to offer support. I decided to take the risk. I had come too far to turn back now. Edmund Gray proved to be a gentleman of perhaps 50 years, with silver hair and kind eyes that had seen too much sorrow. He received me in a modest but comfortable study, offering tea and sympathy in equal measure. "I was James Thornton's brother-in-law," he explained when I had settled into a chair. "His sister Mary was my wife. She died 3 years after James, of a broken heart as much as any physical ailment. I have spent the years since gathering evidence, waiting for an opportunity to bring Henry Ashford to justice. Why have you not acted before now? Because I lacked proof. William Sinclair had the documents, but he refused to share them with me. He was too deeply entangled in Henry's schemes to risk exposure. But when I learned of William's death and your visit to Margaret, I hoped that circumstances might have changed. I studied this man who claimed to share my enemy, searching for signs of deception. I found only weariness and determination, the marks of a long quest nearing its end. "What exactly do you know about James Thornton's death?" I asked. "I know that Henry Ashford had him killed," Gray replied bluntly. "I know that he hired men to make it appear a suicide. And I know that at least one of those men is still alive and might be persuaded to testify if the price were right and the protection sufficient." The room seemed to contract around me. Testimony, proof, justice. These were words I had not dared to hope for. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "What do you want in return?" "I want Henry Ashford to answer for what he did to my family." Gray leaned forward, his eyes burning with an intensity that was almost frightening. "I want him to face the consequences of his crimes. I do not care about his money or his position or his railway. I want him to know, before the end, that he could not escape justice forever. I sat in that Chelsea study as the afternoon light faded, listening to Edmund Gray outline his evidence and his plans. He had been working toward this moment for years, cultivating sources, gathering testimony, building a case that lacked only the final pieces that William Sinclair's documents could provide. With my help, with the evidence I had secured, he believed we could finally bring Henry to account. It was a dangerous proposition. If we failed, Henry would certainly retaliate. My children and I would be vulnerable to whatever revenge he chose to exact. But if we succeeded, we would be free, truly free, not merely separated, but liberated from the shadow of his crimes. I returned home that evening with my mind churning. Henry was waiting for me in the entrance hall, his expression thunderous. "Where have you been?" he demanded. "I have had men searching for you all afternoon." I met his fury with a calm I did not entirely feel. "I have been visiting a friend," I told him. "A friend who shares my concerns about certain matters." Something flickered in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or calculation. What friend? What matters? I smiled, and I saw him flinch at the coldness of it. "You will learn soon enough," I said. "We all will." I climbed the stairs to my room, leaving him standing below, and I understood that we had entered the final act of this terrible drama. The confrontation I had begun in the drawing room would find its conclusion in the days ahead. One way or another, I thought of my children sleeping peacefully in their beds, innocent of the turmoil that surrounded them. I thought of Margaret and little Edward trapped in their liminal existence. I thought of Mary Thornton, who had died of grief, and of all the other victims whose lives Henry had damaged or destroyed in pursuit of his ambitions. I would fight for all of them. I would fight for myself, and I would see this through to whatever end awaited. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and new. But another storm was gathering, one that would sweep away everything Henry had built on his foundation of blood and lies, and I would be the one to summon it. The trial of Henry Ashford became the sensation of the season, filling the newspapers with lurid details and the drawing rooms of London with scandalized whispers. I watched from the gallery as the man I had married was stripped of his dignity piece by piece, his carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of evidence that Edmund Gray and I had assembled. The witness who sealed Henry's fate was a man named Thomas Briggs, a former dock worker who had been hired 15 years earlier to ensure that James Thornton never spoke of his grievances again. Briggs had fled to America after the deed was done, living in anonymity until age and illness had weakened his resolve. Edmund Gray had found him in a tenement in Boston, dying of consumption and desperate to clear his conscience before meeting his maker. The testimony he provided, delivered by sworn deposition and corroborated by William Sinclair's meticulous records, left no room for doubt. Henry denied everything, of course. He proclaimed his innocence with the same conviction he had once used to proclaim his love for me. But the jury saw through him, as I had finally learned to do. After 3 days of deliberation, they returned a verdict of guilty on charges of fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. I was not present when the sentence was pronounced. I had said my goodbyes to Henry the night before, visiting him in his cell at Newgate with a strange mixture of sorrow and relief. He looked diminished in his prison clothes, smaller somehow, as though the removal of his fine suits and polished boots had stripped away something essential to his being. "Why?" he asked me, and his voice cracked on the word. "I gave you everything, Eleanor. A home, a position, children. I made you one of the most envied women in London. Why would you destroy all of that?" I looked at this man I had loved, this man who had lied to me with every breath, and I tried to find the words to explain what he had never understood. "You gave me nothing," I said quietly. "Everything I thought I had was an illusion. The home was built on stolen money. The position was maintained through fraud. Even the love you claimed to feel was a shadow of what you gave to another woman. You did not make me envied, Henry. You made me a fool." He reached through the bars, trying to take my hand, and I stepped back beyond his grasp. "Margaret loved me," he said. "She still loves me. She always will." Perhaps. I gathered my shawl around my shoulders, preparing to leave this place and never return. But love without honor is just another form of captivity. Margaret learned that lesson. So did I. And so I hope, will you. I walked out of Newgate Prison into a grey London morning, breathing deeply of the cold-tinged air, feeling for the first time in months like I could fill my lungs completely. The weight that had pressed upon my chest since the railway inauguration had finally lifted. I was free. The months that followed were difficult in ways I had anticipated, and others I had not. Society divided itself into camps, those who admired my courage in exposing a murderer and those who condemned me for betraying my husband. Doors that had once opened readily were now closed to me. Invitations that had once arrived daily now came rarely, if at all. I learned quickly which of my former friends valued truth and which valued only position. But there were unexpected kindnesses as well. Edmund Gray and his circle embraced me as one of their own, introducing me to a world of reformers and freethinkers who cared nothing for scandal and everything for justice. Margaret Sinclair, freed from her dependence on Henry's guilty conscience, became something I had never expected, a friend. We who had every reason to be enemies found ourselves bound by our shared experience of loving a man who was incapable of loving anyone but himself. My children struggled with the upheaval, as children do. Thomas, at 12, was old enough to understand the broad outlines of what had happened, and his confusion gradually transformed into a quiet anger at the father who had betrayed us all. Catherine, still young enough to be shielded from the worst details, mourned the loss of the life she had known without fully comprehending why it had disappeared. I held them both through their tears and their questions, promising that we would build something new together, something honest, something real. We moved to a modest house in Hampshire, far from the whispers of London, near a village where no one knew us and no one cared about the scandals of the city. I had received a settlement from Henry's estate, contested bitterly by his creditors, but ultimately protected by the courts, and it was enough to provide for our simple needs. We had a garden where Catherine could play, and a study where Thomas could pursue his lessons. We had quiet evenings by the fire and long walks through the countryside. We had each other. It was during one of those walks, nearly a year after the trial, that I encountered the man who would help me understand that my capacity for love had not been destroyed along with my marriage. His name was Robert Hale, and he was the local physician, a widower with gentle hands and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. We met on a path through the woods, both of us startled to find another soul in our private sanctuary, both of us too polite to simply turn away. He inquired about my health. I inquired about his practice. We discovered that we both appreciated long walks and longer conversations, that we both found solace in solitude, but welcomed occasional company. Our friendship developed slowly, cautiously, with none of the overwhelming passion that had characterized Henry's pursuit of Margaret or even his courtship of me. Robert was patient and kind, and utterly without pretense. He knew my history. Everyone in the village knew it by then, and he did not care. He saw me not as the scandalous wife who had brought down a railway baron, but simply as Eleanor, a woman starting over, a mother doing her best, a soul in need of understanding. I resisted my growing feelings for as long as I could. I had learned too well the dangers of trusting my heart to another. But Robert was nothing like Henry. Where Henry had been secretive, Robert was transparent. Where Henry had been ambitious, Robert was content. Where Henry had sought to possess, Robert sought only to share. And slowly, carefully, I allowed myself to believe that not all love ended in betrayal. He proposed on a spring evening as we sat on a bench overlooking the valley below the village. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, and the air smelled of apple blossoms and fresh earth. He took my hand in his calloused fingers gentle against my skin, and he asked if I would do him the honor of becoming his wife. "I am not a wealthy man," he said. "I cannot give you the life you once knew. But I can promise you honesty, Eleanor. I can promise you partnership. I can promise that every word I speak to you will be true." I looked at this man who offered me so little by society's standards and so much by any measure that truly mattered. I thought of the girl I had been, so eager to believe in fairy tales, so certain that love meant grand gestures and passionate declarations. I thought of the woman I had become, wiser and warier, but not, I realized with sudden clarity, beyond hope. "Yes," I said, and the word felt like a door opening onto a garden I had never known existed. "Yes, I will marry you." Our wedding was a small affair, held in the village church with only our closest friends in attendance. Margaret came down from London with Edward, now a lively boy of 4, who called me Aunt Eleanor and showed Thomas how to catch frogs by the stream. Edmund Gray stood as witness, his long quest for justice having transformed into a warm friendship. My children stood beside me as I spoke my vows, Thomas solemn and protective, Catherine beaming with the uncomplicated joy of childhood. I wore a simple dress of pale blue, nothing like the elaborate gown I had worn for my first wedding. There were no society reporters, no dignitaries, no displays of wealth or position. There was only Robert, waiting for me at the altar, with love in his eyes and truth on his lips. As I walked toward him down the aisle of that humble country church, I thought of the railway inauguration that had changed everything. I thought of standing beside Henry as he celebrated his triumph, not knowing that my world was about to shatter. I thought of the journey that had brought me from that moment to this one, through betrayal and heartbreak, through discovery and determination, through the darkest nights of my soul, to this unexpected dawn. I had entered that inauguration alone in every way that mattered. A woman surrounded by lies, kept ignorant of the truth, by a husband who had never truly seen her. I had left it knowing that my marriage was built on a foundation of sand. And now, years later, I stood ready to build again, this time on bedrock. Robert took my hand as I reached him, and his touch was warm and steady. The vicar began to speak the ancient words, and I listened to them with a heart made new by suffering. I had learned that love could be a weapon, wielded by those who cared nothing for the wounds they inflicted. But I had also learned that love could be a shelter, offered freely by those who asked nothing in return but to be allowed to care. When we emerged from the church as husband and wife, the sun broke through the clouds and bathed us in golden light. My children ran to embrace us, and Margaret caught my eye with a smile that spoke of shared understanding. We had both loved a man who was unworthy of us. We had both survived. We had both found our way to something better. I looked up at Robert, at this man who had taught me to trust again, and I felt tears slip down my cheeks. He brushed them away with gentle fingers, his expression questioning. "Happy tears," I assured him. "Only happy tears." He kissed me then, softly, reverently, a promise of all the peaceful years to come. And as I stood in that country churchyard with my new husband and my beloved children and the friends who had helped me through my darkest days, I understood at last what I had been searching for all along. Not the grand passion that burns bright and leaves ashes in its wake. Not the desperate longing that mistakes possession for love. But something quieter, steadier, more enduring. A partnership built on truth, a home built on trust. A future built on the hard-won wisdom of a woman who had learned that the greatest love of all is the love that sees us clearly and chooses us anyway. The railway still runs. Carrying passengers through the countryside, Henry helped to transform. His name has been stripped from the stations and the commemorative plaques, erased from the histories of progress he had hoped would immortalize him. He died in prison 3 years after his conviction, alone and unmourned. A cautionary tale whispered in drawing rooms and business offices as a reminder that no fortune built on blood can long endure. But I do not think of Henry often anymore. He belongs to another life, another Eleanor, a woman who existed before she learned to see the truth. The woman I am now looks forward rather than back, tends her garden and loves her husband, watches her children grow into honest, compassionate people who understand that integrity matters more than wealth or position. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Robert and I sit together on the bench overlooking the valley, watching the sun set in the colors of rose and gold. He holds my hand, and I lean against his shoulder, and we speak of small things, the patients he has seen that day, the letters the children have written from their schools, the plans we have for the garden come spring. And sometimes we speak of nothing at all, simply sitting together in the comfortable silence of two souls who have found their way home. I entered the railway inauguration alone, a woman who did not know that her life was about to change forever. I left it knowing that everything I had believed was a lie. But from the wreckage of that lie, I built something true, something lasting, something that will endure long after the trains have stopped running and the grand stations have crumbled to dust. I built a life worthy of the woman I was always meant to become, and that, in the end, is the only story that matters.